And this month, the topic is freedom of thought and expression. Now, Abraham Lincoln said, "Those who deny freedom for others deserve it not for themselves." That's heavy. How many of you are history buffs? Okay, quite a few. I am not so much. I have to tell you that when I was in high school, I found history extremely dry and boring. And the only time it interested me is when I was in a theater production that had a historical connection to it. Then I wanted to know all about the characters. Well, I've sort of been that way about American history. And then a couple of things happened. Now that I'm the age that I am, I've lived through some of the history, actually. So I have a special connection to that. But also, the first time I went to Washington, D.C., I was surprised how moved I was by the monuments, not feeling like I was especially the flag-waving type. But I was really moved by them, by the inscriptions and the things that had been said by those people. And then this April, Amanda and I went to Philadelphia so that we would be in Pennsylvania for Michael Saker's wedding. And I had never been to Philadelphia, and we went to the sites, the heritage sites. And so there is an area there that was the Pennsylvania State House in, back in the 1700s. And the Continental Congress, the first and second ones, met there. And the first one was while they were still affiliated with King George. The second one was after a lot of stuff had happened. And somebody had even already made a declaration kind of in the group that they were severing ties. But to really sever ties, wow, that was not as easily said as done. And so this is the room in the Pennsylvania State House where the Continental Congress actually met. It's very plain. It's very simple. And as you can see, all they have here is their quills, their books, and their candles. Now, did any of you see the HBO thing on John Adams that was several years ago? If you remember the scene where the Second Continental Congress is wrangling about whether or not they're going to declare a separation from England, they're arguing all day and into the night. They're sitting in this room in candlelight in July. And they're still sweating and arguing with one another. You know, when I think about my sense of the Founding Fathers, it was that they were, very intelligent, reasonable guys who, forged this agreement together. Well, that wasn't the case at all. They practically came to fistfights in the Continental Congress, and then they would go off in little groups and have their conversations, about what had happened and who had happened and all of that. And when they did the original declaration, when Thomas Jefferson was assigned by the Committee of Five to write the actual declaration, this wasn't in that. This is in the Pledge of Allegiance. But we say, with liberty and justice for all. Yes? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Everybody know the pledge? Right? Okay. We've got one even. And at the end we say, with liberty and justice for all. And I still want to say, really? It's kind of with liberty and justice for some or most, or right now these, right now those. And I think, though, that what I want to talk about in relationship to that time, this time, Centers for Spiritual Living, Ernest Holmes, is vision. This is what I want to focus on today. Because what is languaged is the power of a vision that can ignite an entire soul of a people or ignite an entire movement. It may not be that it is lived up to, even in its lifetime, however long that is. But as a vision, that aim is something to continue to push for or strive for or hold ourselves to account for. So in this room where they met, these are their simple tables. This is all they had to work with right there. And in the show, John Adams, this is Paul Giamatti playing John Adams. He's one of the Committee of Five who convinces Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration. And this is what Adams said he said, although Jefferson disputed it later. This is what they put in the movie, too. That he said, you have to write it for reasons enough. And Jefferson says, well, what reasons? He says, well, 3. First of all, you're from Virginia, and this thing ought to start from Virginia. I guess it was the biggest or the most powerful of the colonies. Second, I'm obnoxious and suspected and something else, and you are the exact opposite. Third, and then he said something like, you're a brilliant writer whose work I admire. I can't say the same for myself. So Jefferson said, okay. Now, one of the things to recognize about this is that when this declaration was written, Thomas Jefferson was 33 years old. John Adams was 40. So these guys were young. After they signed the Declaration, this is what Benjamin Franklin said: we must indeed all hang together, or most assuredly we shall all hang separately. And it's funny, and it was funny then, and that was one of the reasons, actually, that they did not want Benjamin Franklin to write the Declaration, because they were concerned that he would stick a joke in it. He was not trustworthy that way. Now, he was 70 at the time, so he was the oldest of the signers of the Declaration, and I guess either more philosophical or because he knew he was closer to the end of his life, he wasn't so worried about what would happen afterwards. I don't know. But here's the thing. When these guys, these 56 guys, signed the Declaration of Independence, 4 of them were not yet 25 years old. Lafayette, the Frenchman who came to help, he was 18. Alexander Hamilton was 21 when all this was happening. These were young guys. And so when Jefferson, this is the house in Philadelphia. It's a reconstruction, actually, but it's a close reconstruction of the house that Thomas Jefferson stayed in while he was writing the Declaration of Independence. It's not very far from where the Continental Congress met. And you can't read this, but, well, maybe you can. So as they started off, there was a preamble that said, when in the course of human blah, blah, blah. And then they started the Declaration, which said, and the way that Jefferson wrote it originally was he said, we hold these truths to be sacred and something. And they didn't want it to sound religious, so Franklin suggested later, why don't we say self-evident? I mean, they are self-evident, aren't they? Meaning obvious. We hold these truths to be self-evident. They don't require proof, they're obvious. First, that all men are created equal. I put all men in italics up there because actually that really wasn't what they meant. When they said all men are created equal, they really were talking about white male landowners, because they were the only ones who could vote. The men who owned property and paid taxes, those were the men they were really talking about. It's just like with the 10 Commandments, when one of the commandments is, thou shalt not kill. The way that they interpreted that was, thou shalt not kill members of your own tribe. In other words, Jews. Everybody else was on their own. So, there's a certain understanding of what they thought they meant, and I'm sure when they said it, they thought they meant all men. However, they also didn't mean women, because women had nothing to do with any of the concerns. And I want to draw your attention to this, because although Jefferson put a section in the Declaration that was about the horrors of slavery, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So endowed, gifted with, unalienable means they couldn't lose them, they couldn't give them away. It was unmistakable. And that among these are life, liberty, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. It doesn't say happiness, it says they're free to do everything they can without causing harm to others to make themselves happy. Okay? So I'm sure that he meant that in his way when he said it. And yet, here, to the right of that building is this plaque. And this is where, whoops, no, that's not what I want to do. I think this is what I want to do, yeah. So this says, while Jefferson labored over every word in the Declaration of Independence, his enslaved servant, Bob Hemmings, provided for his needs. Bob Hemmings at that time was 14 years old. He was Jefferson's body servant. He was the son of Jefferson's father-in-law and one of his slaves. He was Sally Hemmings' brother. At that time, Sally would have been 3, and Jefferson was 30. So even though Jefferson spoke about the evils of slavery, there are slave quarters at Monticello in Virginia, and he had slaves until he died. And we can quibble about who he set free and when and all that kind of stuff and why, but you know, this is the difficulty of having a brilliant vision, putting it into incredibly powerful language, and not even fully realizing its meaning yourself. This happens with poets and playwrights and artists, and it happens with those who are eloquent with written words as well. And so for those who compose these things, they can lift us into this larger vision that was even bigger than what they could bring about themselves. So this is true for us, I think, too, in the science of mind. Our founder, Ernest Holmes, wrote in what we now call our Declaration of Principles. And it starts, I believe, or this is how Holmes originally wrote it, because originally when he wrote it, it was 1927. He put it in what's now called the Science of Mind magazine. And then he said it as what I believe. That's what it was titled. And the first thing he said was, I believe in the incarnation of the Spirit in man, and that all men are incarnations of the Spirit. Now, we can look back and see how Hamilton and the other founders, many of them, chose to interact with their fellow men and women and get an idea of what they thought they meant when they wrote what they wrote. Holmes, because of things that he did, demonstrated that he really did mean human beings, all human beings. And the way we know that is because he was teaching and ordaining LGBTQ students into the ministry way back then without a second thought. And I am told, and we had some of the first African American ministers in a white, primarily white organization anywhere. And I am told that he really read the riot act to one of his ministers who complained about one of the African American ministers drinking at the same water fountain, using the same bathroom. I understand that Holmes took him to task for that. So he demonstrated that he meant inclusivity, even though it doesn't show up in his language, partly because in 1927, it wasn't yet in the consciousness that we shared here. It didn't really become a concern until the 1970s. So if you were born after that, maybe you didn't know that. But that's why people talked like that back then. And this is Ernest when he was quite young. When he wrote What We Believe, or What I Believe, when that was published in 1927, Ernest Holmes was, I gotta get these guys out first, 40 years old. So, we're talking about relatively young guys. The 4 who signed, who were less than 30 years old, it amazes me. Because here's the thing, when you're in the room where they were making these decisions, what you're very aware of is that with all the wrangling and fighting, with all the discussions about what their states needed or didn't need, or what they wanted or didn't want, or whether slavery should not exist or should be left alone, all of those arguments, all of that was going on about whether or not they were going to break away from England, at the heart of that conversation, every one of them knew that what they were doing was treason. So when Benjamin Franklin joked, "We must now hang together, or most assuredly we will all hang separately," that was exactly true, because England had already threatened them with being hanged. So they were making a decision in that room that might have ended their lives. They very well could have lost. And so in the film, in the HBO film, and I don't know if this is how it was or not, after they take the vote finally, and they vote yes unanimously to sever ties with England, there's no cheering, there's no whooping, there's dead, shocked silence. And in that moment, you can just imagine that those that had been on the fence are thinking, here we go, what have I done? What have I done? They took an enormous risk. They took an enormous risk. Part of it was about taxes and property. Part of it was about religion. And part of it was about something that impels us toward freedom, toward liberty, toward expression, toward having the freedom to speak, to express, to be silent, to show up, to choose not to show up, but having that freedom. Now, we know from certain survivors in periods of history, like Viktor Frankl, that it is possible to outlast negative circumstances somehow, and also to not allow a negative circumstance to declare who we shall be or what we shall think or believe. So that there is some kind of a message in these guys that no matter what the circumstances are around us, we do have a choice about how we respond to it, and that choice is what makes us free. So these guys brought forth a vision that was the most noble thing that they could imagine, and we're still growing into it. We're still trying to grow into it. And so I want to share with you a little bit of a comparison between the global vision that Centers for Spiritual Living shares and the Declaration of Independence. These are little tiny excerpts, and I know you might not be able to see them. So I'll tell you, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will tell you the first one from Global Vision for Centers for Spiritual Living is: we envision all people, all beings, and all life as expressions of God. All people, all beings, all life as expressions of God. We envision this. This is our vision. Are we living it fully, completely, absolutely in our organization? We're growing into it. Just like a very similar statement: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Very similar vision. We envision a world where each and every person has enough food, a home, and a sense of belonging, a world of peace, harmony, enfranchisement, and justice. That they are endowed with their Creator, with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Similar vision. I wonder if our statement would have come out of us if our situation had been different, where this organization was born. And then and on this is the last one I'll read to you, although there are more of them. We envision a world where personal responsibility joins social conscience. in every area of political, corporate, academic, and social sectors, providing sustainable structures to further the emerging global consciousness. Now that's Centers for Spiritual Living. Declaration of Independence says, and these are not necessarily in their proper order, any of them either, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Sustainable structures. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Their vision in 1776 resonates in our vision as Centers for Spiritual Living. Our identity is connected in both these ways. I'm going to let the rest of these go. I don't want to read all this stuff to you. So the question of vision and how we're holding it today, both for our country and for the world, both for the larger Centers for Spiritual Living and for us here at Golden Gate, is, are we holding ourselves to the vision that what we want to be in the world? Can we understand and more deeply live this vision? What can we bring that will light the world on fire out of this vision? And in our case, it may not be what we say or the words we use. It may be how we live and how we show up and how we express and how we treat one another in the world. And so if you know someone who is from Mexico or from Honduras or from Guatemala, if you know someone who might have come here at some time illegally, I'm going to suggest that you consider making sure they know their rights. Because the vision of a world that works for everyone means something real. That all men are created equal and endowed, that all people are created equal and endowed with certain rights, unalienable rights. That vision, that passion, that visionary commitment that we stand for as an organization and that they stood for as a new nation of what do we do now? That's what we ride on. That's what we surf from. And that's what we want to live as. So I want to invite you, even if that particular thing is not your way, I invite you to stretch into this vision, because before cells divide, they have to stretch. And if we want to grow further into our vision for Centers for Spiritual Living, into our vision for the United States of America, it's time for us to stretch. Namaste.